Hello. Who are you? Doesn't matter. Welcome. You're safe with me. I'll be right here, nice and close so I can speak without alerting the others. Let me tell you about Senua. Her story has already come to an end, but now it begins anew.
What's happening? It's breathing. The head. It's breathing. It's breathing. He knows she's getting closer. He can feel her coming closer. She's getting closer. They're watching. They're watching.
This video is an examination/review of Ninja Theory's latest game, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, the plot and premise of which will be entirely spoiled by the end. If you have yet to play and are on the fence about doing so, then you're safe to continue watching for now. I'll introduce you to the basic premise without key details first, and then a spoiler warning will be issued when going deeper. So, let's get started. Classifying an exact genre for this game has been tricky for me. It seems to fall somewhere between an atmospheric third-person psychological horror/action/light puzzler and dances between these genres throughout the game. You play as protagonist Senua, who is on a quest to save the soul of her beloved Dillion, and to do so must travel to a place named Hell and bargain with a god named Hela, the ruler of that domain. And as the title of the game implies, sacrifices will need to be made to accomplish her goal. The player takes Senua through a beautifully crafted environment set on the coast of Scotland, between the late Iron Age to early medieval time periods. This time period is never explicitly told to the player, but it can be inferred through the game's plot and lore that makes liberal use of Celtic and Norse mythology, both literally and figuratively, to establish the main enemies and their backstories. The wreckage of Viking ships and clothing worn by the human-shaped characters also point heavily towards this fact, but to be honest, myself being ignorant of most history outside of the last couple of 100 years from the present day, the only things I recognized during my first playthrough were the Viking ships and the name Odin, and even then I was still completely oblivious to the time period. I'm not complaining, I'm just clarifying that this information hasn't been gleaned from superior knowledge and observational skills. I simply got it from watching the making of video within the game and a quick Wikipedia search. So you needn't feel bad if you played through and were just as oblivious as me the entire time. You guide the protagonist through a series of varying environments ranging from the normal to surreal on a linear path where you'll encounter some combat and spatial puzzles that utilize the positioning of objects within the world all the way until the end of the game. This linearity allows the narrative and pacing to be laser-focused, revealing the story to you only at a pace the developers intended. A feature setting this apart from other games of similar ilk is that the protagonist suffers from the mental illness psychosis, a fact which has been openly discussed and used as a selling point by said developers Ninja Theory long before the game was released. The entirety of the game revolves around her illness, and it is left up to the player to decide how they interpret the validity of what they experience. I've a very mixed opinion on this, as I feel the psychosis element was paradoxically both over- and underutilized at the same time, and can potentially also act as a free pass against any criticism of the game design or mechanics, an opinion I will attempt to justify later in the video. Combat in the game is smooth and enjoyable, but relatively shallow. You've the standard light attack and heavy attack, and a shield-breaking kick alongside an evade and block. You then also later unlock a time-slowing and charge attack. Attacks can be chained and parried, followed by a counter, which can be achieved if blocking at the last second before being hit. But if you don't wish to risk this, then the invincibility frames for evasion are very generous. All that being said, Hellblade seems to be very much about the visceral and psychological experience of the main character above all else, with the gameplay elements taking a back seat. It seeks to immerse the player in this experience through visuals and sound as opposed to through the gameplay, a contentious choice given the medium used, but I think the developers accomplish this goal well. The game is kept short and concise, at around 4 hours worth of playtime, and little of that time feels wasted. Though one negative born of the strong narrative focus being all the cutscenes are unskippable, making repeat playthroughs a little arduous if you are just trying to get to a particular section. Oh, and there's a photo mode that you can tinker with if you're so inclined. So after hearing all this, if you think this game is something of interest to you, then I recommend you stop the video here, as I'm about to venture into full spoilers. The game opens with Senua paddling a makeshift log raft down a foggy river or inlet, the narration introducing the player to the plot as this happens. While you listen, Senua's progress downstream reveals a plethora of corpses that are either floating in water, impaled on spikes, and hanging from various places. Clearly something quite nasty happened here, and the visuals paired with the narration set up an effective ominous scene, giving the player a good idea of what tone to expect from the game going forward. Upon gaining control of Senua, I was very pleased at the absence of a HUD or on-screen prompts, and I can gladly say this trend persists throughout. Instead, the game uses the world itself to communicate the mechanics required to play. You encounter various glyph stones throughout the journey. These stones introduce a character named Druth, who narrates the lore and gives more context to the various environments and encounters you later face within them. The style of narration itself strongly suggesting Senua is using the stones as a medium to recount the stories during her meeting with Druth prior to the game's events. As a quick aside from the story, the previously mentioned use of the world to communicate game mechanics and features is something I wish all games would adopt as standard, compromising only when absolutely necessary. We are now able to make stunningly beautiful games that can feature a wide array of artistic styles and animations with great clarity. Whenever a series of numbers and letters and colored bars are stuck prominently in front of all of this, it always detracts from the experience for me personally. We have the technology and experience to show most, if not all, of this information organically within the game world itself by using the sound, visuals, and animations. Dead Space and this game are good examples, and I hope developers experiment with this further, especially if player immersion is an important goal. Of course, I can't deny that there are some games in which a HUD is vital, or is an actual part of the world too. Upon encountering your first glyph stone, it lights up on approach, but nothing happens. Senua, and by extension the player, is then told by the voices in her head that she must focus on the stone, thus prompting me to start pressing buttons to see what happened until the desired result was achieved. A great example of organic instruction within the world, and the game puts this to use often. After this, you continue on a set path before being introduced to your first symbol puzzle, in which the player must match an area of the environment to the shape of the symbol on the door in order to progress. This is introduced in a very small enclosed area with a prominent part of the environment highlighted with additional visual clues when you're standing close to the correct area to see the shape you need. A fine introduction to the concept, which serves to acclimate you to what is further expected down the line. All puzzles in the game will follow this premise in different forms. Find the correct position to view something from the appropriate perspective to advance. After passing this puzzle, you soon encounter another blocked door. It's here you're first introduced to combat with some fodder enemies to learn the basics before being forced to fail. This forced failure is to allow the game to further the plot and warn the player that too many deaths will result in a dark rot reaching Senua's head, causing the quest to be over and all progress being lost. This turns out to be a complete lie, though, which I discovered on my second playthrough when dying intentionally over and over again to try to trigger this event, only to find no changes in the dark rot growth on her arm. I then thought that perhaps dying to separate battles might work instead, but to no avail. I checked online and confirmed the game was indeed telling porky pies. A quick Google search resulted in the usual gaming websites reporting on this fact and giving their own spin on the intentions of its inclusion, all of which were justifications in one form or another. Okay, that's fine. It's up to interpretation until official word is given, if at all. Until then, as with everyone else, I can only speculate on the developer's intentions for misleading the player. Ninja Theory as a company have always seemed to maintain a particular standard and artistic pride and care for their projects as works that have a story to tell. A steadfast principle which I respect them for. It would seem to be incredibly out of character for them to outright deceive the player due to sheer laziness or incompetence. I could of course be wrong, and I'm giving them too much credit, but their reputation has been consistent enough for me to give them the benefit of the doubt. They'd likely have a narrative reason for this deception that is tied to the protagonist's psychosis, and I suspect they are attempting to align the player's psychology closer to that of Senua's to try and add some tension. Ultimately, though, none of it is real. It opens the door for discussion about whether the experience being tangibly real or not actually matters, and begs the deeper question of what reality actually is, and whether the experience is invalidated or not based upon the conclusion, despite the feelings surrounding them being very real to those in the experience at the time. I think the developers were hoping that this thought process would lead to open discussions on the matter throughout social media, which in turn would help keep the game in the public eye for longer. Now, going back to the story and mechanics, with exception of the aforementioned charge attack and the time-slowing mirror that acts as both a lifesaver and a means to make some bosses vulnerable to damage, all of the game's mechanics have now been introduced to the player, whom will continue to guide Senua on a set path through the world, solving a few puzzles and revealing more of the story until the game's end. It's not necessary to walk you through the entire game, because all the events are a product of the protagonist's imagination, effectively making it immune to proper analysis and scrutiny, as everything is intended to be subjective. But I will touch on certain events that should have been impactful, or at least left me with intrigue for what they were, but failed to do so because the ever-present fact of Senua's psychosis ultimately left me feeling agnostic about everything. Before that, though, we'll take a quick look at the combat. In gist, it is fine. It's visually outstanding, but mechanically simple, making it easy to grasp for anyone remotely familiar with melee combat systems in a third-person game. It's smooth and responsive, but hitting an enemy is often missing a certain weight of impact, with exception of the bosses. The animations are excellent, especially on Senua herself, but her sword slides through enemies as if they were made of butter. A proposed solution to this would be to make the frame delay effect more frequent or entirely universal, to help punctuate the impact of each hit, allowing the player to feel more connected to each attack. The combat was at its most enjoyable for me when surrounded by multiple enemies. Successfully evading and parrying attacks with the voices in Senua's head warning me of off-screen threats felt very satisfying when done in succession, and lent the game a smooth flow and rhythm that was nice to perform and even nicer to watch. I would love to see this combat system return in another title, but with more complexity and depth and larger degrees of freedom when moving. I think it would make for a very engaging and enjoyable system. I mentioned before that the psychosis element could potentially be used as a free pass to defend against criticisms. This free pass I will refer to from now on as the psychosis card. For example, my criticism of the lacking weight of impact in the combat could be countered by using the psychosis card. Someone could say the sense of impact is lacking because the enemies are not actually there, and Senua is in reality swinging at thin air. And if one wished to be even more fanboyish, they could further argue that this was the perceived intention of the developers, whom considered this factor when making the combat system, such is their attention to detail and dedication to the narrative, you could say. At this point, things can get hazy because any other attempt to support and defend my criticism could just be met with the psychosis card, and how Senua's mind has manifested these illusions, and thus the flaws in the interactions with them are just a product of her mind, not fully realizing the manifestation. I can only really then respond with, I suppose it's up to interpretation, without any resolution to follow. unless of course the developers were to put their word in. The card could potentially be used for any criticism regarding gameplay, making it a fruitless endeavor, but thankfully I've only two more minor criticisms. One being the rigidness of the environment pathing on occasion, hardly game-breaking and not often encountered though. Second, the level design being a little contrived. It's easy to predict when you're going to encounter a fight, as almost all of the combat sections take place in a rounded arena-shaped part of the environment. But again, the Psychosis card could be played here, so I won't bother going into the semantics. Here is a concise summary of the story which I've understood from playing the game and watching the making of video. Senua suffers from psychosis, referred to as darkness by herself and other characters in-game. Her mother, Galena, is also implied to suffer from psychosis, but it's not made entirely clear. I could be wrong. Senua's father, Zinbad, is a druid. When Senua was a child, her father burned his wife alive for possessing the darkness, and during her early teens he kept Senua in isolation to prevent her spreading this darkness and causing harm, only allowing her out of confinement occasionally. During a rare time that she was allowed out of confinement, Senua encounters Dillion. Sometime in the future, they become lovers. In fear of causing harm to Dillion and possibly other people, Senua decides to expel herself to the wilds to fight her darkness, going against the will of her father, who wants her to remain at the settlement. During her time in the wilds, she meets Druth, the storyteller, who is near death. He tells her the stories that will later make up the main game. Invading Vikings known as Northmen attack her settlement and kill many of the villagers, including Dillion. Dialogue at the end of the game implies she witnesses Dillion's death. The fate of her father was left unknown. She takes Dillion's skull, and sometime later the events of the game begin. Throughout the game, Senua is grief-stricken, and she uses Druth's stories as a coping mechanism that may offer her a chance to somehow save Dillion still. She hallucinates all the enemies and trials faced in the game, possibly representing her guilt for past events that are there to punish her. Ultimately, she defies Hela and sacrifices herself. This metaphorical sacrifice allows her to overcome her grief and loss and accept the death of Dillion and, by extension, her mother. The game ends. As previously stated, this is only my understanding of the story from the information provided and after several days of reflection and replaying. Unfortunately, though, I struggled to enjoy the story while actually playing, due to it seeming incredibly obtuse and fractured. This is where I think the psychosis element was overutilized and greatly detracted from my overall experience and enjoyment of the story, because it left me unable to invest fully in any of what was happening. I could never trust whether the past events were actual true happenings or just Senua's imagination making it up entirely, or twisting and contorting events to suit her own personal narrative. And because the entire game experience is implied to be a construct of her psychosis, I had no definitive sense of a stable reality to contrast it with. If I wasn't informed Senua was suffering from a mental illness prior to playing, then none of this would have been a problem. The whole thing would have left me slightly intrigued and speculating on some details from beginning to end. But the developers publicly announced this key information a long time prior to release, obviously with the intention of using this unexplored and unique premise to help with marketing and hype. Even if I avoided all news before playing, starting the game displays an unskippable warning message informing you it contains a representation of psychosis, which at the very least may plant the seed of doubt in a player's mind. It certainly would have done for me at least. Corpses are littered throughout the environments you explore. They were so common, in fact, that I questioned whether they were really there at all, and I still can't be sure even now. A question I wouldn't have asked myself if I wasn't aware of the psychosis, and made further uncertain by the developer commentary, which mentions they met a real-life sufferer who hallucinates corpses. In-game, these corpses were hung and strewn in so many needlessly complex locations that I couldn't imagine the Northmen taking all that time and effort to secure large spikes in the water or build a system of frames and pulleys just to hang some corpses within an interior. So, all this in mind, perhaps the corpses weren't there. Or only some of them were there? The thing is, if I don't know whether they are there or not, then how am I supposed to know what to feel about them? Another scene of Senua recollecting the discovery of her lover's corpse is accompanied with enraged voices of people citing her as the cause of what happened, leading me to question, at the time, whether in fact she was the killer of her lover and maybe many others, but was perhaps in denial of this fact and created a false reality to escape this truth, exacerbated by her psychosis. Or perhaps they were just voices in her head. I still can't be sure. As it stands, it seems that a lot of the backstory events are real and were intended by the developers to convey the real horror of what Senua had experienced. But at the time, and still now, I can't trust any of it, again, due to being aware of the psychosis undermining everything every step of the way. In another scene, a deep, sinister voice, which is almost as deep as mine, is introduced later in the game, and soon after, another scene where she speaks to her reflection using this voice led me to believe it was a kind of dark alter ego, further strengthening my she could be the killer hypothesis, when in actual fact it's just supposed to be her father's voice acting as a proxy to express her own crippling self-doubt. So, as you can see, my distrust of everything prevented me from connecting and engaging with Senua and her world. You might argue my own ignorance of psychosis's symptoms are to blame for my misconceptions, and that would be a fair argument to level upon me. However, researching the illness and essentially demystifying the whole premise before playing is contradictory to what the game sets out to achieve by attempting to introduce you to the experience of a psychosis sufferer and how it affects their life. Even if I did want to go through the game armed with prior knowledge and a checklist of symptoms the developers managed to portray, having never suffered from psychosis myself and never knowing anyone who has, how would I judge the accuracy of those interpretations? I don't think any non-sufferer could really ever capture the incredibly personal and unique nature of what these people perceive. The complex feelings, comprehension, and perception of these symptoms likely goes beyond anything they could fully express corporeally. Playing the game in this way as a non-sufferer invalidates a significant chunk of the experience. So then I would only be left able to judge the game on a surface level and its accuracy of the portrayed symptoms, that accuracy limited to my own research on the illness. A fairly hollow motivation for playing, I think you'll agree. I feel Ninja Theory already partially did invalidate the experience, though, by being so open about what illness Senua has. They could have mentioned an illness, but been nondescript about it to help reduce this invalidation and leave the players to deliberate amongst themselves. But if they did that, they would then have lacked a unique and compelling selling point for marketing purposes, so I can understand why they chose to reveal it. I mentioned before that the game is entirely lacking a contrast to Senua's psychosis throughout, and I feel this element is where the premise was underutilized. Allow me to share a suggestion on how it could have been done differently. My idea is, rather than immediately submerge the player in complete uncertainty from beginning to end as the game currently does, initially having a clear contrast between reality and illusion that slowly eroded and blurred as events progressed, leading both the protagonist and player to more and more question what is or isn't real, and the implications of such could have been a very compelling theme, I think. This could still also achieve the goal of further educating the player about psychosis by experiencing the protagonist's struggle of dealing with the symptoms and how the different reality it creates intersects with our own. This could have been done a number of ways. The simplest example I can think of is by having a living NPC participate in events to some extent with Senua. This NPC allowing her and the player a clear line to draw between realities and using that to play with the narrative. With appropriate use of pacing, reservation, and ambiguity, the drama and intrigue could have been much more deliberately managed, which I believe could have delivered a much more absorbing and impactful experience that the player could better participate in. Considering the limitations surrounding the game's release though, and the fact the game was developed and published by Ninja Theory themselves, a fact which I enormously respect, it's clear that the project could only have reached a certain scope and scale before compromises would have to be made. Compromises which, in all likelihood, would have lost the game its laser focus and dilute the intended experience. This laser focus is by far its biggest strength. The development team clearly took the subject matter very seriously, based upon the amount of time they spent meeting alongside advisors and real-life sufferers, often letting them playtest and provide valuable feedback through the various build stages. This focus extends to all other aspects of the game too. Due to its relatively short playtime, the team were able to use their trademark art style to craft a world so richly imagined that coming back to watch the recordings for this review and being able to focus on the entire scene was a significantly enjoyable process in and of itself. I must stress the beauty of the world Ninja Theory have created. Their attention to detail excels especially from an artistic standpoint. I've always been a big fan of their design philosophy due to the emphasis placed on using the visuals and sound to capture the emotional tone required to complement the stories of their games. They are also not afraid to use vibrant, attractive, pleasing colors, something which more and more games have been foregoing over the years, where other developers might settle for a more muted tone. Please don't mistake my gushing as a form of bias, however. The actual gameplay of Ninja Theory's games still needs a lot of improvement, as it is often the most shallow aspect. Of all the developers' titles I've played, DMC Devil May Cry has offered the best actual gameplay depth and complexity to date, but it still pales in comparison to its forebearers and many of its peers. The same criticism can be leveled at some of their previous titles, such as Heavenly Sword and Enslaved: Odyssey to the West. Beautifully designed games for their time with a strong, well-told narrative which were longer and far more gameplay-focused than Hellblade, but still almost as mechanically simple. Hellblade seems to be a game made primarily for the player to experience its world rather than its mechanics. The movement and facial animations, Melinda Jurgen's convincing performance as Senua, the great voice acting, sound design, soundtrack, and a wonderful artistic direction all combine together cohesively and clearly display the developer's passion for their craft. However, it might be controversial to say that I had more enjoyment watching my recorded footage than actually playing the game. Unbound from the focused concentration of playing, I could then fully take in all the details the world had to offer. Two particular standout areas for me being Purgatory and Hellas Domain. The combat was especially enjoyable for me to watch. It's the most intense, visceral in-game experience I've observed to date, and I found myself transfixed while watching, a result of all the aforementioned design elements working in tandem. Saying the game is more to experience than to play might rightfully draw you to question its existence as a game altogether. If it's more about the visual and auditory experience, then why not just make it a movie instead? Even its overall playtime is comparable to 2 feature-length movies, or possibly even 1 if you subtract the time used by the cutscenes. That question can only be answered by clarifying what you personally seek from a gaming experience. As an entertainment medium, only games can currently offer an uncompromised experience of both storytelling and interactivity that can possess the longevity and pacing appropriate to serve its world and the story it wishes to tell, without having to compress itself into a limited movie-going time span. If done right, all this can be woven together with engaging gameplay mechanics a person can use to connect with it and make the experience their own in a way that no other medium is capable of doing. If done wrong, though, a story-driven game can be an unfocused, frustrating, disappointing, and confusing waste of a person's time. It all depends on the developers at the helm. If Hellblade were released in movie format, especially with its sensitive subject matter, we have to ask how much of the experience and story would be compromised and lost in the process. I would argue the game already treats your time respectfully and doesn't outstay its welcome. It was also released with fair, consumer-friendly pricing, further displaying a respectful attitude toward the customer. A rarity for the gaming industry indeed, and something I'm sure wouldn't have happened if a greed-driven, exploitative external publisher had any say in the matter. I do wish there was more game to this game, though. It's telling that while playing, the parts I looked forward to the most were the combat sections, no doubt due to my issues connecting with the story. Ninja Theory now has over 14 years of experience under their belt. In that time, they have refined a style that is all their own and maintained a high standard with it, and with Hellblade, I can begin to see an artistic mastery emerging from this refinement. If all the design elements that made this world can be expanded upon in another title, alongside deeper and more meaningful gameplay mechanics to tie it all together, it could quite possibly result in the most compelling game experience produced in recent memory.